In 2023, Hurricane Lila trapped a bankrupt contractor and 3 teenagers in a Louisiana fishing camp. But as the waters rose, they discovered they weren't alone. Someone was hunting during the storm, someone wearing FEMA rescue gear. Welcome to the Nightmare Maestro's Archive, where tonight's tale reminds us that when the waters rise, the deadliest predators wear badges of trust. The air hung thick with tension as Marcus Mack Johnson watched Hurricane Lila's approach on his battered laptop, the only piece of technology he'd kept after the bankruptcy. The meteorologist's voice carried an edge of fear he'd never heard before, Category 5 now, with winds exceeding 175 miles per hour, unprecedented strengthening. A monster bearing down on Louisiana's vulnerable coastline. His construction company's failure still haunted him. Just 18 months ago, he'd been one of Baton Rouge's respected contractors, known for his meticulous attention to structural integrity. His last project had been FEMA contract renovations, storm-hardened buildings that now stood empty, their security systems disabled during routine maintenance. He'd noticed discrepancies in the inspection reports, patterns in the post-storm insurance claims that hadn't made sense. Someone had been systematically altering evacuation zone documentation, but he hadn't understood the significance. Until now, through the window, Mac observed the cypress trees swaying against the darkening sky. His father's logbook lay open beside him, its pages documenting 40 years of storms. Each entry meticulously recorded water levels, wind speeds, and survival notes. The margins held stranger observations, boats spotted during evacuations, missing persons reports, unexplained distress calls. The old man's paranoia had seemed excessive. Now, studying the pattern of disappearances during major storms, Mac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. His phone buzzed. Jamie's text made his stomach clench. Coming to stay, bringing Chris and Tyler. Don't try to stop us. His 17-year-old son, still bitter from the divorce, choosing now to assert his independence. Chris, the star athlete, whose college dreams hinged on a scholarship. Tyler, the quiet tech genius, whose weather models had predicted Lila's strengthening before the National Weather Service, and whose storm tracking forums had been buzzing with threads about unofficial rescue teams that kept disappearing from official channels. The same stubborn streak that had driven them apart after the business went under. The housing market collapse had taken everything. Their savings, their home, even the classic car Jamie had helped restore. Now, examining the camp's support beams, Mac's contractor's eye noted worrying signs. Previous flood marks carved into the wood told a story of rising waters, each storm reaching higher than the last. But it was the other marks that troubled him, small notches next to certain dates, matching entries in his father's logbook about boats that arrived before the official rescuers, about people who disappeared during the confusion of evacuation. Rain started hammering the tin roof as a familiar truck navigated the flooded access road, high beams cutting through the premature darkness. Through the windshield, Mac caught Jamie's expression, that same mix of defiance and fear he'd worn during their last fishing trip, just before the divorce. When they'd spotted those bull sharks circling the boat, Jamie had frozen until Mac guided them to safety. Now, watching his son pilot through the rising water, Mac wondered if he still remembered how to be that father. The radio crackled with evacuation orders as he helped the boys unload their supplies. Chris joked about his father's anger, but his laughter sounded hollow. Tyler kept checking his weather apps, muttering about unprecedented barometric pressure drops. His laptop displayed a forum thread titled Storm Season Anomalies, with dozens of deleted posts, their timestamps matching dates in the logbook's margins. Jamie moved with forced casualness, but his eyes kept darting to the watermarks on the stilts. They'd all made their choice. Now they had to live with it, if the storm allowed them to live at all. The first power lines went down at midnight, plunging the fishing camp into darkness, broken only by battery-powered lanterns and the constant strobe of lightning. Mac positioned the boys in the main room, above the strongest support beams. Each crack of thunder made the windows rattle in their frame. His contractor's eye assessed load tolerances, noting how the old structure swayed differently than during previous storms. Something about Lila felt wrong, the wind patterns unpredictable, the pressure drops extreme. Tyler huddled over his laptop, coordinating with other weather enthusiasts online. His voice trembled as he shared data. Barometric pressure falling faster than Hurricane Andrew, wind speeds exceeding Katrina's peak. The National Weather Service's models had failed to predict Lila's explosive intensification. Chris paced nervously, his athletic confidence evaporating as he read texts from his father, an emergency room doctor already overwhelmed with storm casualties. Through his father's ancient weather radio, evacuation warnings became increasingly desperate. Emergency services reported multiple levee breaches, hospitals losing power, rescue operations suspended. A familiar voice caught Mac's attention, Howard Chen, his former FEMA contact during post-Katrina reconstruction. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static. The boys shared videos of destruction unfolding in nearby parishes. Chris's footage showed cars floating down Canal Street like toys. Tyler had screenshots of Memorial Hospital's emergency generators failing, patients being evacuated in the storm. But it was Jamie who noticed something stranger, systematic patterns in the destruction. Certain areas hit harder than geography alone would explain. The water rose 6 inches in an hour. Mac checked his reference marks on the support stilts, comparing them to his father's flood record. Each carving told a story: 65, 92, 5 Katrina. But other marks caught his eye, dates matching the disappearances noted in the logbook. Beside each mark, his father had carved numbers, body counts. Mac realized with growing unease. A crash from downstream made them all jump. Through gaps in the plywood, they watched their nearest neighbor's roof tear free. The Hendersons had lived there 40 years, their home a repository of carefully documented storm survival strategy. As their roof tumbled into the churning black water, Mac spotted unfamiliar lights moving through the rain, powerful searchlights, sweeping methodically between houses. That's when they heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Multiple engines, moving with purpose. Mac killed the lanterns, motioning for silence. The radio crackled with a new warning. Unauthorized FEMA personnel reported in multiple parishes, using official emergency protocols. The boats drew closer, their occupants' voices carrying over the wind. They weren't calling for help, they were coordinating their hunt. The boats split up with tactical precision, sweeping the flooded neighborhood in a practiced search pattern. Their searchlights dissected each house methodically, revealing professional-grade FEMA rescue equipment repurposed for darker purposes. Through the storm's fury, Mac caught fragments of their radio communications, grid coordinates, structure assessments, casualty counts discussed with bureaucratic detachment. The hunters' radio chatter included specific FEMA codes that Mac recognized from his contracting days, but used in ways that perverted their intended meaning. Each legitimate protocol had been transformed into part of their killing methodology. These weren't desperate survivors or opportunistic looters. Their movements displayed federal emergency response training, their gear including specialized flood rescue equipment and night vision systems. 5 boats, at least 15 operators, all using official emergency protocols. Mac recognized their formation from his construction site security briefings, a standard FEMA search and rescue pattern, twisted into something predatory. Tyler's laptop revealed the horrifying truth. His weather forums were buzzing with reports of similar rescue teams across multiple storm zones. The forum moderators were systematically deleting posts about missing persons during storms, but Tyler had archived everything: patterns of wealthy neighborhoods targeted during mandatory evacuations, emergency channels going dark at crucial moments, rescue teams appearing in areas without official dispatch orders. The pattern stretched back years, crossing state lines, following the paths of major storms. A scream cut through the howling wind. 2 houses down, the Henderson place, the retired couple had refused evacuation, trusting their generator and stockpiled supplies. Through rain-streaked windows, Mac watched the team execute a textbook water rescue approach. Their leader, visible now, wore a familiar FEMA incident commander vest. His movements matched training videos Mac had studied during his contracting certification, perfect form for a rescue that was about to become murder. Chris started to whimper. Mac clamped a hand over the boy's mouth, feeling him tremble. Jamie and Tyler pressed themselves flat against the floorboards as a boat passed beneath. The fishing camp's stilts groaned against the wake, the water level now matching his father's highest mark from 65. One of the operators called out, his voice carrying the clipped precision of federal training. Structure shows recent occupation, Category 3, flood zone, high probability target. Implementing Protocol Echo 7. Water seeped through expanding cracks in the floor as the storm intensified. Mac's mind raced through his FEMA construction guidelines, calculating how long the supports would hold. He recognized their methodology now. They were using official structural assessment protocols to identify vulnerable targets, timing their attacks to coincide with predicted failure points. The house was already beyond its design tolerances, but evacuation meant exposure to both Lila's fury and these methodical killers, men who'd turned their rescue training into a lethal art form. Tyler's phone lit up, his mother frantically tracking the storm's devastation. Before they could stop him, he'd instinctively moved to answer. The glow caught a searchlight beam through a gap in the plywood, a sharp whistle below, followed by rapid hand signals Mac recognized from emergency response training. Confirmed occupancy, 2nd floor northwest, implementing standard extraction protocol Delta 9. The code meant prisoner containment during civil unrest. They were adapting official procedures for their. The boats began encircling their house with military precision, coordinating over encrypted FEMA channels. The rain hammered harder as teams took position, their movements reflecting years of refined technique. These weren't random opportunists. They were professionals who'd learned to hunt during nature's fury, turning government disaster response into a methodology for murder. And now, the fishing camp was their next target. The first breach attempt came from below, targeting the maintenance access point with practiced efficiency. 2 operators, their FEMA gear modified for assault work, tried to breach the trapdoor. Mac's recent reinforcements, inspired by his father's paranoid notes about previous storm robberies, held firm. Their frustrated communications revealed professional training. Access point Delta compromised, switching to contingency breach Protocol 7. Mac herded the boys toward his father's bedroom, stepping carefully on memorized support beams. The old floorboards would betray their position to trained ears below. The water level had risen another foot, and the entire structure swayed dangerously. His contractor's eye noted critical stress points beginning to fail, hairline cracks spreading like spiderwebs across the ceiling. Behind a false panel his father had installed decades ago, they discovered more than emergency supplies. A waterproof case contained detailed records of similar incidents, newspaper clippings about disappearances during storms, photographs of suspicious rescue teams, and a manual on FEMA emergency response protocols. The old man had been tracking these predators for years. Among the supplies lay an old hunting rifle with ammunition, and a note, "They always come during the big one." A calculated impact shook the house. The attackers had driven one of their boats directly into a key support stilt, the strike point showing expert knowledge of structural engineering. Water poured through widening cracks as the house listed significantly. Tyler's weather equipment showed the pressure still dropping Lila's eye wall, approaching with unprecedented intensity. The storm was eroding their shelter while their hunters forced them to stay put. Chris snapped first. The 16-year-old athlete bolted for the window, his survival instincts overwhelming reach. He'd seen too many storm surge videos, calculated their chances with mathematical precision. "I can swim it," he insisted, eyes wild. "I was state champion. I can make it to higher ground." Mac lunged for him, but was too late. The boy squeezed through a gap in the plywood before anyone could. The current took him instantly. His powerful swimmer's build meant nothing against Lila's fury. The searchlights tracked his desperate attempt, the operators commenting with professional detachment. Target self-extracted. Monitoring for recovery. Their calm voices carried over the storm, discussing casualty probability statistics based on current flow rates and debris pattern. When Chris vanished beneath the churning black water, They simply logged the coordinates for later retrieval. Tyler started forward, but Jamie held him back, displaying a sudden mature strength. Below, the hunters resumed their siege with mechanical precision, discussing structural weak points and time calculations until the eye's arrival. The house groaned as another support beam crashed. Max studied the blueprints in his father's files, his mind racing through load-bearing calculations. A terrible realization dawned. The only way to survive a compromised structure was to control exactly how it failed. These men had used their rescue training to become efficient killers. It was time to turn their expertise against them. Mac's construction expertise crystallized into a desperate plan. His father's files revealed the fishing camp's original blueprints, including stress calculations and flood tolerances. Every structure had engineered failure points, designed weaknesses that could direct a controlled collapse. The support system followed FEMA's post-Katrina guidelines, which meant their hunters would have predictable expectations about its behavior. Their own training would become their weakness. Working quickly, he modified key support joints while the storm intensified. Each alteration had to be precise. Too much damage would trigger an immediate collapse. Too little would fail to spring the trap. Jamie watched his father work, architectural terms flowing naturally as they discussed load distribution and shear stress. For the first time since the divorce, he saw his father as more than a failed businessman. He saw an engineer, a craftsman who understood how things broke and how to make them break exactly right. The hunters' radio traffic revealed their evolution. Protocol Echo 7 established. Implementing Katrina parameters, Mac recognized the codes from his FEMA contracts. Legitimate rescue protocols twisted into a methodology for predation. Their documentation detailed previous operations with cold precision, spreadsheets tracking casualties against property values, cost-benefit analyses of target selection, efficiency metrics for their recoveries. They weren't just killers, they were bureaucrats who'd turned disaster response into a science of murder. Tyler accessed their FEMA credentials through his laptop, tracing their unit back to Hurricane Maria recovery operations. The data revealed their transformation, from opportunistic looters to organized predators, learning from each disaster response, perfecting their technique through years of storms. They'd started as legitimate responders, gradually realizing how easily emergency protocols could be weaponized. Each disaster had refined their methodology until killing had become as routine as filing reports. Their leader's voice carried clear command authority as he coordinated the final approach, structure showing Class 2 stress fatigue. Occupants will evacuate to the north-facing section based on standard civilian survival protocols. Position recovery teams accordingly. His assessment was textbook perfect, except for one crucial detail. Mac had rewritten the rules of how this particular building would fail. The house swayed dangerously with each wave, the compromised supports creaking in protest. Water leaked through the ceiling as pressure differentials distorted the entire frame. The hunters noticed the structural damage, discussing collapse probability vectors with professional detachment. They just had to wait, or so they thought. Mac positioned Jamie and Tyler in the most stable corner, then took his father's rifle to the window. The old weapon felt foreign in his hands. He'd always dismissed his father's paranoid preparations. The logbook's final entry now made chilling sense. They're getting bolder, using our own protocols against us. Next big storm will be their perfect cover. Each page documented their evolution, from random disappearances to systematic predation, refined through decades of storms. He fired 2 shots into the air. The response was immediate and precise. The hunters recognized the weapons report, discussing caliber and range with military expertise. They'd encountered armed resistance before, documented every confrontation in their cold reports. Mac's voice shook convincingly as he shouted down to them, playing into their expectations of civilian behavior under stress, offering surrender, begging for mercy, playing the prey they thought he was. Jamie and Tyler verified the trap's trigger points one final time as boat engines roared to life. The storm had stripped away their civilized pretenses, revealing the brutal truth. Sometimes survival meant becoming as methodical as your hunters. These men had perverted their rescue training into a science of predation. Now, that same science would become their undoing. Hurricane Lila's eye brought an eerie calm, the sudden silence more terrifying than the storm's fury. Moonlight illuminated the flood's devastation, transforming their neighborhood into a dark mirror. The water had erased familiar landmarks, creating a nightmare landscape of submerged homes and floating debris. The hunters' searchlights revealed glimpses of their efficient destruction, doors professionally breached, rescue equipment repurposed for assault, systematic documentation of their recoveries. 4 boats approached the fishing camp in standard FEMA search formation. Their leader stood in the command vessel, his incident commander vest bearing authentic agency patches. His night vision gear and tactical equipment suggested federal training, but his manner revealed something darker, the calculated precision of someone who'd learned to exploit disaster response protocols for maximum efficiency. Through Tyler's laptop, they monitored the hunters' radio traffic. Their operational terminology was flawless, perfect acronyms, regulation call signs, textbook coordination, but the content revealed their true nature. They discussed previous successful extractions during major storms, comparing casualty rates and asset recovery statistics. Each tragedy had refined their methodology, turning emergency procedures into a lethal playbook. The leader addressed them using standard FEMA civilian communication protocols, his voice carrying rehearsed authority. This structure is compromised beyond safety tolerances. Surrender now for emergency evacuation. His teams moved into predetermined positions, their formations reflecting years of modified rescue training. Each man knew his role in their grotesque parody of civil service. Mac played his part perfectly, his voice cracking with calculated fear as he negotiated. He referenced his father's game warden boat, still moored beneath the house's far side. A valuable asset in their operation, made more tempting by its official registration. The leader's interest was immediate. They preferred government-registered vessels for their legitimacy during subsequent operations. They took the bait, executing a standard 3-point breach pattern. The first operator stepped exactly where Mac had calculated, his weight triggering the weakened support joint. For a moment, physics hung suspended. Then, engineering took over, each compromised beam transferring load exactly as designed. The collapse began with architectural precision. Support structures failed in sequence, creating a cascading breakdown that followed Mac's careful calculation. The attackers recognized their mistake too late, their own training telling them exactly how the building was failing, but unable to prevent. Their leader screamed orders, his professional demeanor cracking as he watched his perfect operation dissolve. One operator demonstrated his advanced training, swinging from a hanging power line to reach the intact section. His movement showed military-grade agility and situational awareness. He oriented himself with tactical efficiency, raising his weapon toward Mac's position. Below, the fishing camp's remaining supports groaned under shifting weight distributions, promising complete structural failure within minutes. The hunter had escaped their trap, but in doing so, had placed himself exactly where Jamie's earlier calculations had predicted. Jamie moved with unexpected precision, all those childhood hunting lessons with his grandfather suddenly relevant. The old rifle cracked once, the sound almost lost in the renewed shriek of Lila's approaching eye wall. The hunter's tactical expertise, honed through countless operations, proved useless against a teenager's desperate shot from point-blank range. His body joined his companions in the flood, the dark waters claiming another predator. The remaining boats scattered in disarray, their carefully documented protocols useless against unplanned catastrophe. Nature's raw power proved more devastating than their engineered malice. 2 vessels capsized in the sudden onslaught, their emergency beacons activating automatically. The hunter's own FEMA equipment now broadcast their positions to legitimate rescue services. Tyler's weather equipment revealed the approaching eye wall's unprecedented intensity. The fishing camp's death throes followed textbook structural failure patterns, each support beam surrendering in calculated sequence, the old building finally yielding to the combined assault of storm and strategic damage. Mac guided the boys onto what remained of the roof, their movements following his father's documented evacuation procedures. The wind tore at their clothes as they watched their hunters struggle against the rising waters. These men had meticulously planned for every contingency, maintained spreadsheets of survival probabilities, documented every possible scenario except their own destruction. Their training meant nothing against Lila's fury. Nature, unlike their victims, couldn't be cataloged or controlled. Through gaps in the roiling clouds, a familiar sound grew louder, the rhythmic beating of Coast Guard rotors. The legitimate rescue services had waited for the eye's passage, knowing it was their only window for safe operations. The hunters' own emergency protocols had predicted this timing. Now those same calculations sealed their fate as the flood claimed their vessels one by one. As the rescue basket descended, Mac recognized the pilot's voice over the radio, Howard Chen, his old FEMA contact, one of the few who'd suspected something wrong during previous storms but couldn't prove it. The hunters' documentation, preserved in Tyler's downloaded files, would finally expose their operation. Each carefully maintained record of their atrocities would now serve to bring them justice. From the helicopter's vantage point, they witnessed the fishing camp's final moments. The structure that had sheltered generations of their family surrendered to the flood, taking with it his father's years of paranoid preparations that had ultimately saved their lives. The old man had understood that the real monsters weren't supernatural creatures, but humans who'd learned to hunt during nature's fury. Jamie's hand found his father's as they flew toward safety, his grip conveying a new understanding. They'd both seen humanity at its worst, trained protectors turned predators, using their knowledge to exploit those they'd sworn to save. But they'd also rediscovered their own strength, rebuilding trust even as their world collapsed around them. The storm had washed away their old grievances, leaving behind a foundation far stronger than the one they'd lost. Sometimes, Mac realized, it took facing real monsters to remember what was worth fighting for. If tonight's tale has you double-checking the credentials of emergency personnel or looking twice at rescue boats during storm, remember, the most dangerous predators are those who've learned to hunt when nature's fury provides cover. Share your own hurricane survival stories in the comments below, or tell us about times when something about a supposed rescuer just didn't feel right. Don't forget to subscribe to the Nightmare Maestro and activate notifications to ensure you never miss another tale of terror lurking behind badges of authority. After all, there are countless more stories where those sworn to protect become the ones we need protection from. Until next time, stay safe during storms. And remember, when the waters rise, not everyone offering help intends to be your savior.